inspired to pick up yourself and go. You will find it's all you need to do. Reach down inside and find out you're the one to fly, yeah, the one to reach. You can do all things, just choose.
Blessings, blessings, blessings. I am going to ask you to please share, like, tag, go live, comment, and subscribe. My guest for today is my dear niece, Dr. Kiana Battle, a licensed social worker. Kiana, tell us about grief. Why me? Why not me?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be on the show and, of course, spending time with my dear aunt who I adore. So, grief, why me? Why not me? So, really, that's the premise of a book that my husband and I, Pastor Keith Battle, we had written in 2015. Really, it was my personal story, if you will, regarding the loss of both my mother and my father. And the title really came about, God dealt with me, because I think oftentimes it's really a challenge to learn how to really internalize and process the grief of a loved one, specifically a parent. But I didn't want to just have self-pity about it. I knew that if God allowed me to go through it, that He would also provide me an opportunity to be a blessing to other people. And so why not me? And so if that didn't happen, I would not be, on your show this evening, hopefully able to encourage others who are impacted by grief and loss. And so that's really the premise behind grief. Why me? Why not me?
Right. That's powerful. That is very, very powerful. How would you define grief?
So that's a good question. One thing I want to first say, as a licensed social worker, it's very important that, we share with those who are watching that everyone has their own grief experience. So by no means is my grief experience someone else's. But grief would be defined as the normal psychological reaction to loss. And so, I've once heard someone say that grief is truly the expression of love. And so when you grieve something
Wow.
and or someone that you love. So it's a normal reaction to loss.
How does grief impact someone?
Well, grief can impact, as I said, everyone differently. It depends on their own experience. My work has really been in trying to provide support to children impacted by grief, children and adolescents. I often say, even when the book came about, I was 28 years old, and I know I'll probably share my story a little bit later, but I was 28 years old when I lost my mom, and my world stood still. And so it made me think, how does a child handle that? Because they're still developing and trying to figure out who they are. And so children experience grief differently than adults, but everyone will experience grief differently. And it's also surrounding on the type of grief. You have complicated grief, you have disenfranchised grief. Grief is really a traumatic experience. And depending on how, the loved one passed away, that's really going to provide the context of someone's grief process. So it is unique. It's not meant to be the same for everyone. However, universally, we all experience grief.
Right. Wow. Is grief normal?
It is. And I love that question because oftentimes people tend to put a pathology around grief as if it's something abnormal, as if you're just supposed to get over it. But that's not the way things go. Grief is normal. And as I said, it's the normal reaction, a psychological reaction to a loss. And so there's nothing abnormal about it. And I think it's so important that we have conversations like this to help people understand that what they're experiencing is valid, and what they experience certainly needs to be normalized, because as humans, we all will experience grief and loss at one point, in our lives.
Right. What are the stages of grief?
And so, the stages of grief, we know there's great work and credence given to Dr. Kubler-Ross, excuse me. She was really the groundbreaking doctor who did groundbreaking research on grief and loss. And so we know that the 5 stages, I tend to look at it more as a cyclical process. And
Okay.
because when you think of a circle, it just never ends. It goes into each
Keep
other.
going around. Right.
Sometimes you may be at one stage and then other times you may be at the other. So traditionally, the 5 stages of grief are denial, right?
Mm,
When your loved one passes, oftentimes you're
right.
receiving that information, you're in denial because it's hard
Yes.
to process. And so you've got denial, and then generally you may experience anger. You might be angry. Why did this situation have to happen? Hence the title, why me, why not me? Initially, that anger comes in. And then you may go through bargaining where you try to say, well, what could I have done differently? Maybe
Yes.
I could have done this, right? And so then from that, and again, this is a cycle. So you may be in denial at one moment, and then you may be at bargaining, and then you may get to anger, right? Um,
Right.
so after bargaining, generally there may be depression. And, I just want to say that we all go through a type of depression, particularly when we lose someone that we care about, regardless of the relationship. But that in and of itself is normal. We get concerned with depression when it deals with the frequency. So how long, right? And that's for a doctor to determine if it's going to be an issue. But we all get sad sometimes and get depressed, but there's a clinical type of depression, and that's not what I'm talking about right now. And so when you look at the stages, generally after depression, you get to the place where you accept it. So it's acceptance. But again, it's not scaffolded like stages for everyone.
Right.
It's cyclical.
Go around and around. Right.
You may wake
Wow.
up one day, you may be angry, and it may be 4 years that your loved one is gone, and you've accepted it, but you're still angry. You know what I mean?
Right. 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 And for myself, I went through all those stages that you just named. Every last one of them, I went through it, and just like you said, it goes just a circle, a circle. How have it been personally? How have you been personally impacted by grief?
Yes. And so obviously, very well, but just to share with our guests and also to try to help support and provide a context to grief, since we're talking about grief, why
Right.
me, not me. When I was 28 years old, I lost my mother, and my world truly stood still.
Right.
Everyone has a different relationship with their loved ones, their parents, but my mother and I were extremely close. I have 4 siblings, which, you
Yeah.
but sharing to others. And I was the eldest and the only girl. And so my mom and I were like this. So I was 28 when she passed, and that was detrimental on all levels. But if you fast forward time 6 years later, I lost my father. And
Right.
so you think about complicated grief, right? And so I went through my process. I asked God, why me? I am a Christian. I do believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. And even in that, I still ask why me, right? And so it was very hard. And as a social worker professionally, it really prompted me to want to do more research about, grief, particularly as it relates to children and adolescents, because like I said, I was 28 when my mother died. I was fully grown,
Right.
well, right? I wasn't going
Right. Right.
back in time. But even at 28, it was very hard to process it. And so I thought about, what about a 15-year-old or a 10-year-old who's still figuring out who
Exactly.
they are in the world? And so that's when I really put with prayer and doing some research to really look into that more. And that's sort of been my process and journey. And so you dealt with me to write the book. It wasn't so much for my research as a professional social worker, but from a Christian perspective, I wanted to talk about it
Right.
because I think sometimes as Christians, or sometimes depending on what your faith is, we kind of just push it under the rug, and we don't talk about, grief, and we just say pray about it. But we've got to talk about it. We've got to normalize people's experiences so that they can get the support that they need.
Right.
And so
Right.
as a 40-year-old adult today, it still hurts. It's been about
Of
12
course.
years has been gone, and my dad about 7 years, but I still go through those cyclical stages.
Right.
Mhm.
Of course. Of course. I hear a lot of people say, they go to church and, members of churches, and they feel that the church wasn't really supportive to them. How can the church support people impacted by grief?
Oh, that's a great question. And so, the other hat that I wear, I happen to be married to a pastor of a church, and some
Right.
of the things that we deal with head on. I think because my experience with grief has helped me to be more sensitive and more empathetic to others who experience grief. So I know at our church, we've had the opportunity in the past to provide grief support groups, just talk and shares for our
Right.
members and those who want to participate. So, to answer your question, I think church leaders should be very mindful that yes, you can pray about it, but you've got to deal with it. You've got to get it in and do.
Yes.
You don't want to leave people alienated and people having to process their grief without feeling like they have support. Because anyone who's experienced the death of a significant person in their life, whether it's a parent, whether it's a spouse, whether it's a sibling, whatever that relationship is, it meant something to that person. And so the last thing they need is to feel isolated, because oftentimes grief is isolating.
Right.
So I think for faith-based leaders, having grief support groups, providing opportunities to talk about it, not just saying, well, I'm going to pray for you. That's important, but people need some tangible support. People need to know that you're supporting them and you're in it for the long haul. And I think the book really talked about that. Again, everyone's process is different, but I think we can do a better job in churches to really support not only our members, but people who are impacted by grief.
In the community and stuff. Right. Right. Wow. Wow. Do people ever get over death or and loss of a loved one?
I love that you asked that question because I hear it so much, and I constantly have to tell people, with all due respect, I know that people sometimes are lost for words and they want to say the right thing, but you
Right.
never get over it. If we talk about grief as an expression of love, just because that person is not physically here anymore, that doesn't mean that you stop loving them. So you don't
Right.
get over it. But I do think that you learn how to live your life differently, and you learn to adjust your life without your loved one physically being there. As I said, it's been about 12, 13 years that my mom has been gone, and I'm never going to get over the loss of my mom. I just won't. But I've learned to live my life differently without her physically being here, as with my father. And so I think we've got to be very sensitive to people. And sometimes we want to say something because we feel like we need to say something, but we've got to think about what we're saying before we say it, because it can often be very insensitive and it can do more damage than help when we say, oh, it's 2 years. You should be over it by now.
Right. Right. Because you
Mhm.
never can, everybody go through grief differently.
Absolutely.
Wow. What can people do to help them cope with their grief?
Well, that's a good question. And again, because everyone's grief process is unique to them, but some things that generally work, and again, these are generalizations, but talking to someone. So even what we're doing tonight, bringing awareness to the issue of grief and loss, people want to feel validated. So certainly talking, counseling, seeking out licensed professionals. As a licensed social worker, I'm a little biased to other social workers, so reaching out to a social worker and or a therapist who can help you. Journaling, I know that's a therapeutic technique that often is very helpful because it provides a level of reflection. I actually journaled and sometimes still do, particularly in the beginning of the loss of my parents. I would journal often. Certainly they couldn't respond to me, but at least I got those thoughts out of my heart,
Out of your
of my
right.
head, and onto paper. So support groups, professional counseling and journaling, and just giving yourself the time, to know that it's okay. and there's no expiration date on it. You take the time that you need.
Right, right. I know, like for me, that last question was definitely something that I needed to know, because although your mom was my sister, is my sister, but I still go, I don't mention it or talk about it, but I go through my changes with it, with losing her and losing Sheila,
Mm-hmm.
your aunt Sheila, and maybe I will start journaling and putting down my thoughts and my feelings and stuff like that. And another thing that happened with me is that I felt guilt. I
Mm-hmm.
felt a lot of guilt. Is that normal to feel, the guilt?
And it
I should have did this. I should have said that. I should have did this. And I remember one time I was so mad with your mom, and we didn't speak for about 2 weeks. And I
Mm-hmm.
promise you, I wish I had those 2 weeks today.
Yeah.
Glory. I wish I had those 2 weeks today
Yeah.
to speak to mom.
And I understand that, and thank you so much, Arnisi, because as much as we're family, everyone's experience is different, and so I don't know
Yes.
if you've heard that before, but when you talk about feeling guilty, that's part of that bargaining stage, because
Right.
we bargain. I should have did this. I shouldn't have said that. I mean, we never know when a loved one will not be with us. We're in the middle of this pandemic, right? There's projections that it's going to be more heightened, and we may lose more people. So the reality is we don't have a crystal ball, but it's normal to feel that way. But what I always say, since grief is an expression of love, your loved ones often know, you love them while they were here. And that's all you can do, is do the best that you can do, because nothing that we can do can bring them back. And so what keeps me going is honoring the legacy of my parents by educating others
Yes.
who work with young people and who work with people who are experienced grief and loss, to try to educate them so they can better provide services and support to those who are going through, because we're all going to experience this in some level, or not. And it's just important that we have the tools.
Right.
I'm also a professor, and I always teach my students that, my job is to provide you with the tools. So when you're along in your journey, you can pick up your toolbox and you can use the right tool. And so that's
Right.
what we're doing today. We're planting the seed, one, to talk about it so people know that it's normal, that is nothing to be ashamed about. And if you are a person who believes, and if you are a Christian, then you know that in time, right, the Lord will strengthen you in this. But
Yes.
we're human and it hurts. And I think we've got to do a better job of being honest about that it hurts and it's okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. And I had mentioned your mom, but also with your father. Me
Mhm.
and your father, Charlie, was very close.
Mhm.
And it was a big loss for me as well. He was my number one supporter. No
Mhm.
matter what, Charlie always supported me. You could do it, niece. You could do it, niece. That
Mhm.
was my Charlie. So everything that I do, if you look at some in my books, you will see that I dedicated to your mom, Sheila, grandpa, and your dad. And I will
Absolutely.
always dedicate it to them.
Absolutely. And I think, and I love what you said, because when God puts a mantle on us, I once heard that someone said, well, actually, my husband said it just recently, that often
Mhm.
our dark places is our divine place.
Woo,
So
glory.
if our dark place is our divine place, the loss of both my parents, that was extremely a dark place for me, but
Right.
that catapulted me to be in a position to try to support others who are going through. And if nothing else, that's what we do when we go through, so we can help other people, whether that's professionally, whether that's in our churches, whether that's in our local community. We have an obligation to give back, to pay it forward. And this is my little piece of that, as a social worker, bringing those things together to try to help other people who are impacted by grief and loss.
Right, right, right. And this is a sensitive topic to everybody, to the world right now, because of the pandemic, and so many people have lost loved ones. their parents and different things like this. I think this is an on time interview with grief, and loss, But let me ask you, Kiana, if you don't mind. So like we spoke about grief as far as losing a loved one, losing a parents or loved one. I also remember when I was younger and we moved from one town to another town. And looking at it today, I think I was grieving.
Absolutely. So I love what you said because I think that's important too. So grief and loss is not specific just to the death of someone. As a former school social worker, I would often work with children who were impacted by the foster care system or had
Mm,
that were incarcerated or parents who were in the military, so they moved constantly. So there is a loss in that, right? And so
mm-hmm.
have to be mindful that it can cover several components. However, my area of expertise is truly specific to the loss of a loved one, excuse me. But the reality is that you can experience grief anytime you lose something because you're shedding something. And again, if we talk about it being an expression of love, if you're a kid and you're used to living in one neighborhood and you have friends, that's something you love. So when that's
Right,
taken away from you, you're going to grieve that. And so I
right,
think so much room for further dialogue when we talk about grief and loss on the spectrum, because there's so many different areas that it can cover. But as I said, specific to the research that I've done and my professional area of expertise, it's been specific to, the loss
the
of a
loss.
second loved one.
Right, right, right. Wow. It's it's by the grace of God that, you know, because of grief and loss of a loved one that we are still in our right minds. If that makes sense to you. Because Nita, Sheila, they were my heart. Charlie, and it really does hurt. It really does hurt. And I'm sure those that are watching live could testify as well. That it's a really, really painful. And if it wasn't for God to strengthen us, you know,
Absolutely. And so I stand here on the shoulders of my parents, and I stand here as it is for the grace of God to be in a position now that I'm strengthened. Certainly, I'm still
yes,
healing. I would never say that it's complete because you asked me that
yes,
question in the beginning, and it's an ongoing process. But now is my opportunity to pay it forward, as is yours, and as is maybe someone else listening. Instead of getting into this self pity, we're going
right,
through that process. But you say grief, why me? Why not me? Right?
right,
So now I'm going to pay it forward. And so the reality is it hurts. The reality is at some point in our lives, we'll all experience it, but it's our perspective towards the process um, that can really, change. And we want to normalize that experience for those who are impacted by grief and loss and be very sympathetic but more so empathetic, particularly in the climate that we're in now in this pandemic. People are hurting. And so, those of us who know, we want to try to provide support.
right, right. And I want to ask you, um we have to do a part two, maybe a round table. I would get it out there for those that would like to be a part, and you can run the round table, for the loss. What do you say about that?
Wow. Well, I feel honored and privileged, and certainly wasn't expecting that. But thank you. I think it's a topic that certainly lends itself to further discussion. And if I can be of any support, then certainly count me in. Thank you for asking me.
Thank you. So I would like to thank you for being a part of the Denise Newsome show. It was so necessary to have this discussion, and I know without a doubt that it definitely blessed someone. So again, I thank you for gracing the show. And I would like to thank everybody that's watching live. I appreciate you. I love you. And I hope this was a blessing to you. And I'm going to ask you to join us next week. My special guest is Pastor Keith Battle, who is Kiana's husband. And he's going to
Amen.
give us a word on next week. He's going to give us a powerful word. You think she powerful? Where there's a good man, there's a good woman. And where there's a good woman, there's a good man. So definitely tune in next week. And I love you and I appreciate you. And happy Thanksgiving to you.